At first light on the misty morning of 03 August 1944, near a quiet place the German maps called Villa Bicag, an armoured reconnaissance patrol rolled forward along a damp country lane, engines muttering and metal creaking in the cold air. Through fogged binoculars they suddenly caught sight of several low silhouettes bursting out from behind hedgerows and garden walls, wheels kicking up dirt, engines revving hard as if they had nothing to lose. In the few seconds before the first shots were fired, every lesson these men had been drilled on about vehicle recognition flashed through their minds like frames of an old newsreel. Low hull, crew of 3 or maybe 4, a stance that looked more dangerous than any simple truck. When the shooting died down and the patrol pulled back, their after-action report, signed by Corporal Karl Weber, sounded utterly professional. Enemy light, armoured cars sighted, armour-piercing ammunition recommended, infantry to maintain a minimum distance of 200 metres. On paper, it was a textbook assessment, exactly what German doctrine expected. The cruel joke only appeared later. Those supposed armoured cars were nothing more than Willys MB Jeeps, American-built reconnaissance vehicles weighing about 1,090 kilograms, made almost entirely of thin, unarmoured steel and canvas. No turret, no real armour, just flat panels that rang like cooking pots when struck. Years later, when Weber was a prisoner of war, he would admit that if you had parked one of those jeeps beside him in peacetime, he would have sworn he could punch through the bonnet with a single angry blow. These machines had no right to be listed as armoured fighting vehicles, no right to survive a serious exchange with proper German reconnaissance units, and certainly no right to make German infantry hesitate before stepping out of cover. Yet by the autumn of 1944, British forces in northwest Europe had quietly transformed hundreds of battered, worn-out, or officially beyond economical repair jeeps into what the soldiers themselves called battle wagons, improvised gun platforms that German troops consistently overestimated, tried to avoid when possible, and treated with the wary respect normally reserved for real armoured cars. In wartime newsreels shown in American cinemas, jeeps still appeared as cheerful companions of the common soldier, bouncing along sunny roads, while a narrator with a confident voice called them faithful friends of democracy. Out in the hedgerows of France and Holland, under low grey clouds and the whine of artillery, those same little vehicles began to inhabit a very different role inside German minds, a kind of wandering steel ghost that might appear at a crossroads and suddenly vomit streams of tracers. What made this transformation possible was not some secret upgrade in an American factory, but a principle British units had learned the hard way in North Africa and Italy. On a confused battlefield, where dust, smoke, fear, and half-remembered training fight for control inside a soldier's head, the appearance of capability can matter almost as much as capability itself. The Willys MB had been designed as a simple quarter-ton truck, a light reconnaissance runabout with a small four-cylinder engine, a rugged frame, and enough power to drag men and equipment through mud and over broken ground. In the hands of inventive workshop crews and hard-faced reconnaissance officers, that simplicity became an invitation. If a vehicle was already written off on some clerk's ledger, why not strip away comfort, forget the rule book, bolt on weapons, and turn a useless hull into something the enemy might mistake for a predator? Somewhere between the official image in propaganda films and the panicked notes in German field reports, the battle wagon was born. By the time those little jeeps reached the battlefields of northwest Europe, they were already tired before they ever smelled cordite. On some docks behind the lines, a bored clerk would lean into a dusty instrument panel and see the odometer sitting at 3,000 or even 5,000 miles. Depot to port, port to holding area, convoy to embarkation, then on to the units that needed wheels more than they needed perfection. Once they joined a British armoured reconnaissance regiment, the real abuse started. A jeep assigned to a patrol troop in 11th Armoured Division might grind through 80 to 120 miles in a single day, rattling from pre-war French tarmac to muddy farm tracks, bouncing over rubble-filled city streets, where entire blocks had become jagged canyons, then chasing retreating German units across fields that had never seen a vehicle before. On a neat War Office chart, 20,000 miles was marked as a reasonable service life before a major overhaul. On the ground, 20,000 miles was a distant dream that always seemed to move away with the horizon. Mines did not care about tables. Artillery airbursts did not respect maintenance schedules. A single burst of machine gun fire through the engine bay could leave the block intact but shred the radiator, fuel pump, carburetor, wiring, all at once. By October 1944, the average jeep in a British armoured reconnaissance regiment had already covered more than 15,000 miles, and many were hanging together through sheer stubbornness and grease. The official answer for a truly sick vehicle was to send it back to base workshops for proper rebuilding or, if the cost in parts and labour climbed too high, to strip it and write it off. But shipping a cracked engine block back across a supply system already straining under ammunition, fuel and winter clothing felt less like prudence and more like surrender. In the rear areas of a typical British armoured division, 20 to 30 jeeps would sit in a sad row near the workshops, one with its front end twisted by a mine blast, another with its chassis bowed from an artillery near miss, a third with the bonnet and grille chewed open by machine gun fire, so that the engine underneath looked like the exposed ribs of some dead animal. They were, on paper, beyond economical repair, and yet, as the mechanics walked past them with oily hands and burnt tobacco in their lungs, another classification formed quietly in their heads. Still has 4 wheels, still has an engine, still moves. Inside a makeshift workshop tent one cold evening, sparks jumped and hissed as a welder cut through a bent fender, the smell of hot metal mixing with stew from a nearby field kitchen. A young corporal fitter cursed cheerfully at a seized bolt, while an older sergeant, who had once served in the desert with the long-range desert group, leaned against the wing of a damaged jeep and watched a staff officer sign yet another form that consigned the vehicle to the scrap column. When the officer walked away, the sergeant tapped the bonnet with a knuckle. It gave a thin, hollow ring. He smiled anyway. In the desert, he told the corporal, they had driven jeeps so shot to pieces that you could see the sand through the floor. Yet those wrecks had carried extra water, extra fuel, and enough guns to rip apart an isolated convoy. Here in Europe, the landscape was greener and the roads were narrower, but the principle had not changed. A few minutes later, over mugs of tea stained darker than engine oil, the workshop crew floated an idea that sounded half drunk and half brilliant. If a jeep was already dead in the eyes of the bureaucracy, why not treat it like a blank canvas? Strip away the burnt bodywork, forget about comfort, bolt on whatever weapons you could scavenge, and send it back to the front as something new. They joked about building monsters, gun carts, desert specials for the hedgerows. But beneath the laughter, there was a hard, practical edge. Every jeep reborn in their hands would be one less request for a brand new vehicle that would never arrive on time. Every wreck that could still roll might be turned from a pile of spare parts into a platform that mattered. Somewhere between the columns of numbers on the War Office forms and the messy reality of mud, blood, and improvisation, the idea of the battle wagon took root. On a damp afternoon in late November 1944, under a sagging canvas roof that rattled each time the wind crossed the field, the workshops of Guard's armoured division turned one more, written-off jeep into something else entirely. The process looked chaotic to an outsider, but it followed a rhythm that the fitters could almost do in their sleep. First came the stripping. Off went the windscreen frame with a screech of abused hinges, then the canvas top, the side curtains, the doors that had once tried and mostly failed to keep out rain and dust. If the bonnet and front wings were too twisted from blast or impact, they were cut away as well, leaving the engine and front axle exposed to the grey air. Seats that had carried officers and radio operators across half of Europe were unbolted and tossed aside. Within an hour, what had arrived as a battered vehicle looked more like a bare skeleton on 4 wheels, a frame, an engine, a steering wheel, and pedals sitting over roughly 680 kilograms of steel. On paper, the standard Jeep suspension was rated to carry a little more than 360 kilograms of payload, but everyone in that tent knew from experience that the springs would tolerate closer to 500 before they truly complained. That margin, shaved from years of rough handling, was the space in which the battle wagon lived. Once the Jeep had been reduced to its bones, the fitters began to rebuild it in a new image. A steel pedestal rose from the chassis in front of where the passenger seat had once been, welded down with thick, ugly beads, that would have horrified peacetime instructors but held just fine over rutted tracks. On top of this post, they mounted a Vickers K gun, a compact .303 caliber weapon that weighed scarcely more than 10 kilograms, but spat bullets at a rate that could saw the branches off a tree in seconds. The front gunner, often a man like Private Peter Clark, would stand there during battle, feet braced wide, hip pressed against the post, hands locked on the spade grips as he swept hedges and windows with fire. At the rear, in the space that had once carried kit bags and ration boxes, another heavier pedestal took shape, its baseplate welded directly to reinforced sections of the chassis. This was the throne of the Browning 50 caliber heavy machine gun, its steel mass close to 40 kilograms before you even added the weight of the mount. When a man such as Jack Morgan climbed behind it, standing on a rough wooden platform bolted across the frame, he controlled a weapon that could punch through engine blocks, chew apart brickwork, and send German crews diving for cover. Around these two hungry guns, the crew arranged belts and boxes of ammunition like a strange metal harvest. 1,000 rounds of .303 added more than 70 kilograms on their own, and 500 rounds of 50 caliber tipped the scales by another 85, every bullet a tiny promise of chaos waiting to be claimed. Then came the part that official doctrine frowned upon. Manuals written in distant offices warned that adding armor to an unarmored vehicle would overload the suspension, strain the engine, ruin handling, and give only the illusion of safety while actually trapping the crew in a metal coffin. Every word of that warning contained truth. The men in the workshop simply decided that the truth needed to be bent. Instead of wrapping the Jeep in a solid shell, they thought in slivers and angles. From the carcasses of knocked-out vehicles and from the stocks of the Royal Engineers, they scavenged 6mm steel plate and cut it into rough rectangles. One such piece, perhaps 60 centimeters wide and 45 tall, was welded in front of the driver as an angled shield, weighing only around 15 kilograms, but capable of stopping rifle bullets and shell fragments from many directions. Around the positions of Clark and Morgan, they placed curved sections of plate in a loose semicircle, leaving gaps big enough for a man to squeeze through but small enough that, from 200 meters away through a haze of smoke, the collection of pieces looked like continuous armor. In total, the extra metal seldom exceeded 40 to 60 kilograms, yet visually it transformed the Jeep. Shadows pooled under the new edges and corners, turning a once familiar silhouette into something harder-edged, more menacing. When the crew finally clambered aboard, 3 or 4 men in total with perhaps 300 kilograms of muscle, webbing, and nerves, the little vehicle sat lower on its springs and its ride would be, as one driver later said with black humor, absolutely appalling. Fully loaded, it weighed between 1,100 and 1,200 kilograms, still just within what its axles and springs could endure. The steering grew heavier, the braking distance longer, the body leaned at alarming angles in tight corners, yet the simple ladder frame and its willingness to flex turned into an unexpected ally. Each time the Browning thundered, the entire chassis shuddered and swayed, absorbing some of the recoil that might otherwise have torn a more rigid mount apart. In that ugly welding, in those stolen plates, lay the secret of the battle wagon. Nothing about the conversion would have passed a peacetime inspection. It offended neat design and careful paperwork. But on a muddy track at dusk, when the rebuilt Jeep came howling toward a crossroads with its guns already firing, the only thing a German observer would see was a fast-moving shape throwing heavy fire, clad in what looked very much like armor. For the men who rode it, that was enough. For the enemy who had to decide in a heartbeat whether to stand or run, it was sometimes everything. Late afternoon on 14 October 1944, near the Dutch town of Venlo, the sky hung low, and the light had the flat grey taste of rain. A British reconnaissance troop moved cautiously along a narrow road lined with poplars. In front rumbled 2 Humber scout cars, their thin armor plates smeared with mud. Behind them came a single Daimler armored car, heavier, more confident, its turret tracking slowly from side to side. At the very back, almost an afterthought on the troop roster, bounced a Jeep battle wagon under the command of Sergeant James Whitaker, with driver Robert Hale at the wheel, Peter Clark gripping the Vickers K in the front, and Jack Morgan standing watchful behind the Browning 50. The German position that awaited them was no hasty barricade of farm carts. Blocking the road was an SD, KFZ, 222 armoured car, about 4.8 tons of steel with 8mm armour and a sharp-nosed turret carrying a 20mm cannon. Around it, dug into ditches and among the trees, waited some 30 infantry from a Volksgrenadier regiment, 2 MG-42 machine gun nests set to rake the road, and a 37mm anti-tank gun hidden further back like a coiled snake. On paper, doctrine would have expected the Daimler to engage while the scout cars searched for flanks and the jeep stayed carefully out of the way. What happened instead had the jagged rhythm of a scene from a documentary that no one ever filmed. The first burst of 20mm fire came without warning, a string of bright sparks walking up the road and hammering into the turret of the Daimler. 2 rounds struck with a heavy metallic thud that echoed through Whitaker's headset. They did not penetrate, but they rang like distant church bells inside the crew's skulls. The Daimler commander, suddenly aware of how exposed his vehicle was, ordered his driver to reverse into a hull-down position behind a small rise. The Humber crews attempted to swing out through the fields to the left, only to find their paths stitched with accurate rifle and machine gun fire that snapped branches from the trees and drove them back toward cover. For a brief, dangerous moment, the troop hesitated. The textbook solution would have been to pull back, call for artillery or tanks, and treat the roadblock as a problem for heavier forces. Whitaker looked at the same scene and felt something different, a hard, cold line of opportunity. To the Germans, every vehicle in that column was already a potential armoured threat. If one of them behaved like a true predator, perhaps the enemy would believe it was. He leaned forward, tapped Hale's shoulder, and shouted a simple order over the engine noise. The jeep lurched out from behind the nearest Humber, engine screaming as Hale forced it up through the gears. At roughly 35 miles an hour, it charged straight down the road toward the German position. Clark's Vickers K chattered to life, first, pouring .303 bullets into hedges, onto the roadblock, into the muzzle flashes of the MG-42 seconds. The rounds could not harm the armoured car, but they pinned the infantry, drove heads into dirt, and spoiled their aim. At 200 metres, with the SD, KFZ, 222 filling his sights, Jack Morgan squeezed the butterfly triggers of the Browning 50. The heavy gun answered with a slow thunder, each shot a deep, separate crack that rolled across the fields. 47 rounds left the barrel in a burst that felt both endless and horribly short. Most hammered against the front and turret of the German vehicle and sparked away, unable to defeat its hardened armour. But some found weaker places, seams and joints where steel met glass or thinner plate. At least one round struck a vision port squarely. Inside the cramped hull, the world turned into a storm of splinters and noise. The German crew did not stop to measure damage or consult doctrine. They kicked open the hatches and bailed out, stumbling and crawling away from the roadblock that had just died in their minds. With their armoured support suddenly abandoned, and continuous fire still raking their positions from what they believed was a purpose-built fighting vehicle, the infantry began to fall back in 2s and 3s, then in a ragged stream. Behind them, the silent 37mm gun stayed unmanned. No one had thought to bring it forward. When the shooting finally tapered off and the troop secured the area, the jeep was still running. Later inspection counted 11 bullet strikes on its frame and fittings. 3 had smacked into the improvised armour plates and stopped. The others had punched through unprotected panels, through a water tee. Days afterward, British intelligence captured a German log entry describing the engagement. According to that report, the unit near Venlo had been attacked by several armoured scout cars. No mention of a jeep, no hint that the most aggressive vehicle on the field had started life as a quarter-ton truck that the workshops had already written off as scrap. In the space between what the Germans thought they saw and what was really there, the battle wagon had done exactly what it was built to do. In the weeks after Venlo, the jeep battle wagons began to slip into war diaries like recurring ghosts, never central to the grand strategy, but always turning up at awkward moments for the enemy. On a cold morning in late October, one such jeep from an armoured regiment lay in wait near a crossroads where a German staff car was expected to pass. When the dark sedan finally appeared, its occupants relaxed by the illusion of rear areas and curtains drawn against the chill, Jack Morgan opened fire with the 50 at a range of barely 150 meters. The burst tore through thin bodywork and glass as if they were paper, killing or wounding the officers inside and scattering across the roadside a precious cargo of maps and orders that would later reveal the intentions of an entire Panzer Grenadier regiment. In early November, 2 battle wagons supported an infantry assault near a small village, hosing down 3 machine gun positions and a mortar team that had pinned British riflemen behind a stone wall. Their guns did not demolish bunkers or level buildings, but the ruthless speed with which they shifted fire from one muzzle flash to the next broke the German line of sight and allowed the infantry to rush forward. On a grey day, 19 November, a single jeep took up position at a road junction when a German counterattack felt imminent. For 17 long minutes, its crew fired nearly 800 rounds of mixed-point .303 and 50 caliber ammunition at every shadow and movement along the tree line. To the men on the other side, hearing the slow, heavy rhythm of the big gun and seeing tracers flick across the crossroads, it must have sounded like a small armoured detachment, and they edged away until the opportunity to counterattack simply evaporated. Captured later, soldiers from those units struggled to describe exactly what they had faced. Private Hans Kramer spoke of small English tanks without roofs, very fast, and suddenly everywhere at once. Sergeant Ernst Vogel, a veteran in a worn field cap, told his interrogators that these were light reconnaissance vehicles with unusually heavy armament, and that his men had been instructed to treat them as armoured threats and to employ anti-tank weapons rather than rifles, when possible. Their fear and respect did not emerge from official recognition manuals, which contained neat drawings of standard British vehicles, but no mention of these mongrel creations. It came from the way the battle wagons behaved. They did not skulk at the rear like ordinary soft-skinned trucks. They pushed into the edges of firefights, appeared on flanks, roared up to crossroads with guns already blazing. German tactical doctrine, very proud of its ordered responses, had little room for a vehicle that looked like one thing, sounded like another, and acted like something else entirely. By December 1944, a captured operations order from the 89th Infantry Division contained a telling sentence. British reconnaissance elements include both genuine armoured cars and armed jeeps, modified to appear as armoured vehicles. Distinction is difficult at combat ranges. Engage all such vehicles with anti-tank weapons where available. That single line was exactly what British commanders had hoped for, even if many of them never read it. Each time a German unit burned a precious Panzer round or committed a scarce gun crew against a jeep that had once been marked as scrap on a workshop form, the arithmetic of the campaign tilted minutely in Allied favour. Back in London and Berlin, newsreels still showed grand machines, Tigers and Panthers grinding forward, Shermans cresting ridges, Spitfires glittering against the clouds. Nobody queued at the cinema to watch a story about a cut-down truck with 2 machine guns and a few crooked armour plates. Yet when historians later sifted through reports and testimonies, they began to see a subtle pattern. These ugly, nameless battle wagons rarely decided battles by themselves, but time after time they forced the enemy to fight as if facing something bigger. On a modern map of the campaign, that distortion of perception is almost impossible to draw. On the ground, in the moment when a German lieutenant had to choose between advancing with rifles or waiting for a gun that might never come, it could be the difference between a counterattack that happened and one that died before it began. By the last bitter winter of the European campaign, somewhere between late 1944 and the first months of 1945, the quiet army of battle wagons had reached its peak. British Second Army counted them not in proud official tables but in workshop notes and margin scribbles. Roughly 280 converted jeeps in use, scattered across reconnaissance regiments, independent brigades, and odd companies that had the right mix of daring officers and imaginative fitters. They were born from a larger graveyard of machines, around 840 jeeps that had been written off through combat damage or mechanical failure as beyond economical repair. About 1 in 3 of those rejects was dragged back from the edge, stripped, re-welded, armed, and sent once more toward the sound of the guns. Their losses were heavy in human terms and strangely light on paper. By the time Germany surrendered, some 73 of the converted vehicles had been destroyed or damaged so badly that even the most stubborn sergeant had to admit defeat. That meant a loss rate of about 26% over roughly 5 months of hard fighting, higher than that of regular armored cars, but still regarded as acceptable. Administratively, every battle wagon destroyed was a vehicle that had already been counted as dead before it ever carried a gun or fired a single shot, so the ledger barely trembled. When the time came to demobilize, there was no place in the new peace for these ugly, effective compromises. They had never appeared in formal procurement files because no one had ordered them from a factory. They were invisible in official strength returns because they had no line on any establishment table. Many did not even have proper names in the diaries, just notes about armed jeeps or modified reconnaissance vehicles. Once the uniforms were packed away and the steel helmets put in cupboards, the battle wagons went back to being what the system had always said they were: damaged jeeps not worth saving. Cutting torches bit into their frames on quiet summer mornings in 1945, and the plates that had once fooled German infantry were weighed as scrap. Only a few airbrushed photographs, blurred in the background of other subjects, and a handful of German intelligence reports hinted that they had ever existed. Years later, in a museum courtyard far from Venlo or the muddy fields of Belgium, an old man in a tweed coat might stand in front of a perfectly restored Willys Jeep, its paint fresh, its canvas tight, its bonnet shining in the weak sunlight. On the little metal plaque at its side, the text would talk about a reliable quarter-ton truck that served on every front, a faithful servant of Allied armies. The veteran, perhaps someone like James Whittaker with white hair and a stick, would smile in a way the guidebook could not explain. In his memory, the jeep that mattered most did not look like this polite exhibit. It reeked of burnt oil, its panels were kinked and scarred, 2 machine guns towered over the crew, and crooked patches of steel caught the light as it lurched into battle. When modern officers and scholars look back on such stories, many see more than a quaint anecdote about a clever conversion. They see a principle that runs like a buried wire through many later conflicts, from desert technicals mounting heavy weapons on civilian pickups, to guerrilla groups welding steel cages on commercial trucks, to any force that has more nerve than budget. Proper equipment used by the book will usually beat improvised weapons used carelessly. Yet improvised equipment used with a sharp understanding of enemy doctrine, psychology, and the fog of war can punch far above its true weight. The Jeep battle wagons proved that sometimes the most useful weapon is not a new gun or a thicker plate, but a change in how you think about the wrecks already lying in your yard and about the picture forming in your enemy's mind. On those crowded battlefields of northwest Europe, they were never the stars of the show, yet again and again they stepped into the gap between expectation and reality and forced the other side to flinch first.